The shove came without warning, Daniel's elbow connecting hard with her shoulder before Zara could even register what was happening. And then the floor was rushing up to meet her. The cold marble of the Lotte World Mall slamming into her knees and palms as the display stand behind her collapsed in a cascade of shattering glass and holiday ornaments. For a moment, the entire second floor went silent. Zara looked up from the floor, her palm bleeding where a shard had caught it, her champagne silk dress torn at the shoulder. The contents of her shopping bags scattered across 20 feet of polished marble like the wreckage of a life she had spent 2 years carefully rebuilding. And she looked at the man standing over her with contempt written across his face as plainly as if it had been carved there. Daniel Osei, her ex-fiancé, the man who had taken everything from her, who had left her homeless and pregnant and destitute, stood over her and said, "Stay down. You were always better when you stayed down, Zara. At least then, you weren't in anyone's way." He had absolutely no idea. He had no idea about the two men who had been holding careful, invisible positions 20 feet away since the moment she left the penthouse that morning. Men with earpieces and dark jackets, and the particular coiled stillness of people who had spent years in rooms where violence was a language fluently spoken on both sides. He had no idea about the diamond band hidden beneath her glove, or the penthouse in Gangnam she had kissed her husband goodbye in just 4 hours ago, or the black card in her bag whose limit his entire net worth could not touch. He had no idea about the name that was now legally, permanently, irrevocably attached to hers, the name that made city officials choose their words carefully, that made men in 3 countries go very still when it entered a room, the name the Seoul underworld whispered with a mixture of fear and something that bordered on reverence: Kwon Seojun, her husband. And at this precise moment, in a boardroom on the 42nd floor of a tower in Yeouido, that man's phone was buzzing with a 2-word message from his head of security. And whatever meeting he was in had just effectively ended, because Kwon Seojun had already put down his pen, already stood, already told his driver to move. Daniel Osei had kicked the wrong woman. He just didn't know it yet. If you already know this man is about to have his entire world taken apart piece by piece, hit that like button right now, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Because what happens when Kwon Seojun walks through those mall doors is something you absolutely cannot miss. Now let's go back to where this morning began. Earlier that morning, Zara had been standing in their walk-in closet for 6 minutes, which Seojun knew because he had been watching her from the doorway for 5 of them, coffee in hand, a quiet smile on his face that he made no particular effort to conceal. And she was doing what she always did, which was to stand in front of a closet the size of a modest studio apartment, surrounded by runway pieces and hand-selected designer labels, and reach past all of it toward the back section, toward the older things, the ones she had brought with her when she moved in. "You're going to pick the beige again," he said from the doorway, and she turned, startled, then smiled. That particular unguarded, slightly embarrassed smile that still did something complicated to his chest each time he saw it, no matter how many months had passed. "I like the beige," she said, entirely without apology. "I know you do," he replied, crossing the room and taking the hanger from her hand with the calm deliberateness of a man who had thought this conversation through already, replacing it with a champagne silk dress that had been hanging, unworn, since he bought it for her 3 weeks ago. She held the dress up and looked at it the way she always looked at expensive things, with a mixture of genuine appreciation and a reflexive anxiety about deserving it, and said, "Seojun, that's too much for just shopping." To which he responded, without blinking and without any performance whatsoever, "Then I'll buy you another one," which was the kind of answer that still disarmed her completely, because he meant it as simply as other people said good morning. "You're impossible," she said, taking the dress. "You say that like it's a complaint," he said, handing her the coffee. This was their morning ritual: the coffee, the closet negotiation, the particular warm quiet of a Gangnam penthouse, before the city demanded anything from either of them. And Sarah still sometimes stopped in the middle of it and felt a wave of something so large and unnameable that she had to simply let it pass through her. Because fully acknowledging the distance between who she had been and who she was now was more than she could hold all at once. She had come to him through a chain of accidents and survivals that she still wasn't entirely sure she had deserved. And yet here she was, married, cherished, standing in a closet that cost more than her first 5 apartments combined, arguing about silk dresses with a man who had bid 120 million won for a private cooking lesson at a school charity gala, simply because he had spent 40 minutes watching her move tables and heels and decided he wanted to know her name. That had been 14 months ago, and they had been married for 9 of those months. And every morning she woke up in this penthouse was another morning she had to make a deliberate, conscious choice to believe that she was allowed to keep it. At the bathroom mirror, applying a single coat of lip gloss while he knotted his tie, she said, "I'll take Minna and Ji-hoon with me," meaning his security detail. And without looking up from his reflection, he said, "And Park," naming his head of personal security with the tone of a man stating a fact rather than making a request. "Seojun, I am going to buy Christmas gifts, not negotiate a ceasefire." "You can do both, if the situation requires it," he said pleasantly. And when she turned to stare at him, he finally looked at her with that expression, direct, patient, absolute, and said, "Park goes, non-negotiable," in a voice that belonged not to her husband, but to the other man, the one the streets named, and she had learned across 9 months of marriage to recognize the difference between the two. "Fine," she said. "Park goes." He crossed to her then and pressed a kiss to her forehead, then her cheek, then the corner of her mouth, each one slow and deliberate, each one a small private declaration she had come to rely on the way she relied on air, and said, "I have a meeting at Yoido until noon. Text me when you get there." And she said, "I always do." And he said, "I know, I just like asking." And she smiled against his cheek. He had enemies, not as a metaphor or an exaggeration, but as a precise operational fact. Men who resented the reach of his empire, competitors who had tried and failed to undercut his holdings, ghosts from his father's era who carried grudges across decades with the patient dedication of men who had nothing better to do with their anger. And the underworld Seojun had inherited at 26 when his father died and left him an infrastructure held together by fear and favors, and the very specific kind of loyalty that only money and power and the occasional demonstration of absolute ruthlessness could buy, was not a forgiving landscape. Sarah knew this, had come to know it the way you come to know something that cannot be unknowed, incrementally and irreversibly, through the bodyguards and the late phone calls, and the night she woke at 3 in the morning to find him standing at the bedroom window in the dark, perfectly still, watching the Seoul skyline with the expression of a man accounting for everything he owned and everything it cost him. She had come to stand beside him that night without being asked, had taken his hand in the dark without saying anything, and that had been the moment he understood that what he felt for her was not ordinary, because ordinary feelings did not survive what he was. They'd burned or curdled or left. And what Sarah gave him was something else entirely, something he was still, after all these months, learning the full name for. At the bedroom door, he paused and looked back at her. Silk dress, coffee cup, that warm and slightly amused expression she wore in the mornings when she was most herself, and said, "Text me." And she said, "I will." And then, softer, "I love you," and it still reached him every time, like something that bypassed all his careful training and landed somewhere unguarded. "I love you more," he said, and left before she could argue the point. The mall. The Latte World Mall in Jamsil was the kind of place that made ordinary life feel slightly cinematic, simply by virtue of its existence. 6 floors of polished marble and architectural glass, Christmas installations, turning every corridor into something that belonged on a film set. The kind of retail cathedral where even the air smelled expensive, and the holiday music seemed to have been composed specifically to make you feel that whatever you were about to spend was not only justified, but long overdue. Zara moved through it with Park a step behind her, and Min-ah and Ji-hoon flanking at a distance that looked casual to anyone who wasn't paying close attention. And she had grown accustomed to this rhythm over the months. The way Park's eyes never fully stopped moving. The way Min-ah drifted half a step closer when a crowd compressed. The particular quality of being protected that was nothing like being watched, and everything like being accompanied by people who had decided, for professional and increasingly personal reasons, that she mattered. She was buying Christmas gifts, a soap scarf for her friend Abena, books for the children in her after-school program, something for Seojun's housekeeper, Mrs. O, who performed indifference to kindness with the commitment of a professional actress, and then kept every card Zara had ever given her in a small wooden box on her kitchen shelf. And she was, genuinely and without effort, happy, which was a condition she still sometimes stopped to examine with the careful attention of someone who had learned not to trust it. She had just stepped out of a stationery boutique on the second floor, bags in both hands, when she looked toward the jewelry display ahead and felt the happiness drain out of her body as completely and suddenly as if someone had pulled a plug. He was standing near the entrance of the boutique, laughing with the loud carelessness of a man who has never faced real consequences. His arm draped around a designer-clad woman, dripping in the kind of wealth he had always craved but never earned honestly. And he looked healthy and untouched by guilt and infuriatingly, insultingly good, as though 2 years and a ruined life and a baby lost in a charity ward hospital had happened to some other story in some other universe that had nothing to do with him. Zara's shopping bags felt suddenly very heavy in her hands. She thought about Seojun's voice that morning. "Text me when you get there." The ordinary, steady safety of a man who took her seriously. And she thought about another morning, gray January, a hospital discharge form, the sound of her own breathing in an empty corridor at 6 a.m., with nothing but the clothes on her back, and a grief so enormous she couldn't find the bottom of it. She told herself to keep walking, because she was different now, and he had no power over her, and the woman she had become in these past 2 years had no reason to tremble in front of a man like Daniel Osei. Her feet, however, had a memory of their own. Daniel looked up, and their eyes met across the open space of the second floor, and she watched recognition move through his face in sequence. First surprise, then something that took a moment to identify because it was so disproportionate, so unreasonable, so completely unearned, contempt. "Well," he said, detaching himself from the woman's arm and walking toward Zara with the comfortable swagger of a man who has never once worried about approaching someone he has wronged. "I don't believe it, Zara." He said her name like it was something slightly amusing, a relic from a chapter of his life he had long since closed and moved on from. "Still in Seoul? I figured you would have gone home by now." "I live here," she said quietly, which was both true and in this moment the least of what she could have said. He looked her up and down with the slow, appraising gaze of a man taking inventory, scanning the dress, the bags, the quiet competence of the way she was standing, and said, "Shopping somewhere expensive? Found some rich Korean man to take care of you, have you?" With a smile that made the question sound both condescending and somehow triumphant, as though confirming a theory he'd had about her all along. "That's none of your business," she said, and she meant for her voice to be indifferent, but it came out too careful, too controlled, which meant he could hear the effort in it, and men like Daniel had always been very good at hearing effort. "Come on," he said, glancing back at his girlfriend, who had drifted closer to watch. "I'm just asking. Playing the victim until some fool takes pity on you. That was always your talent, wasn't it, Zara? Looking helpless just long enough for someone to feel sorry enough to—" "Daniel, walk away," Something shifted in his eyes, something old and mean and reflexively resistant to being told no by her specifically. And he took a step closer, the kind of step that was designed to remind her of how much smaller she was, how much less space she was permitted to occupy, and said, "Or what? You're going to cry? Call the police? Please, we both know there's nobody to call, Zara. There never was." She felt it, then. The old wound, tearing open with casual, practiced cruelty. The way only Daniel had ever known exactly where to press. And behind her eyes, the memories came without permission. The note on the kitchen table, the emptied bank account, the apartment she lost, the car she lived in for 3 weeks in a Mapo district car park. Too ashamed to tell anyone and too broken to fight. And the Tuesday morning in January, when she woke in a hospital bed and understood that she had lost the baby, and that she was alone, and that no one was coming. "I'm going," she said, turning, because she was different now, and she did not have to stand here and let him do this to her. His hand closed around her arm. "I'm not finished," he said. And the girlfriend was watching, and a few shoppers had slowed, and someone already had their phone out. And Daniel's voice had dropped into that particular register she had spent 3 years learning to fear. Low, proprietary. The voice of a man who considered her attention something he was owed. "You made scenes when I left. You called my family. You embarrassed me. I think you owe me an apology for that, at minimum. Let go of my arm, Daniel, or you'll do what?" He pulled her back, harder than was necessary. And Park was already moving, but not quite close enough. And Daniel's elbow connected with her shoulder in the stumble. And then the display stand was behind her, and she was falling, the floor coming up fast, the glass shattering, the Christmas ornaments raining down around her, in a silence that spread through the second floor of the mall like a wave. And when it reached its full extent, the entire building seemed to hold its breath. Zara lay on the cold marble and looked up at the man standing over her, and she felt the blood from her palm and the ache in her knees and the tear at her shoulder. And in the background of all of that, she felt something else, something quieter and more certain than pain. The absolute, own deep knowledge that Daniel Osei had just made the most catastrophic mistake of his life and had no idea. Not yet, not even slightly. "Stay down," he said, his voice ugly and low. "You were always better when you stayed down." Park had Daniel on the floor in 4 seconds, efficiently and without spectacle, and Jihoon was crouched beside Zara, checking her pulse with practiced hands, while the entire second floor processed what it had just witnessed. And around the ring of watching, recording strangers, the name was beginning to move from mouth to phone to mouth, in a murmur that Zara could hear even through the ringing in her ears. "Kwon. Is she?" The security supervisors exchanged a look. Zara's phone rang. She looked at the screen, and something in her chest unclenched in a way she hadn't realized was clenched. She answered, "If you need to see Kwon Seojun walk through those doors right now, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because part 2 is where everything, and I mean everything, comes apart for Daniel Osei." Drop a comment. What do you think a man like Seojun says when he sees his wife on the floor? Let's continue. "Are you hurt?" His voice was completely, unsettlingly calm. The kind of calm that was not the absence of feeling, but the precise, disciplined containment of something very large, held under pressure with the practiced control of a man who had spent years learning that visible anger was a liability. "I'm okay," she said, and before she could say anything else, "Your palm is bleeding," which was not a question, because Park had reported already, and she understood that she had approximately 30 seconds before whatever wheels he had set in motion became irreversible. "Seojun, it's a small cut. I fell, and the security team has him already, and I just want to come home." "Who is he?" His voice had not changed pitch or temperature, but the question arrived with a weight that told her he was asking not for the name, but for the story. the one she had given him in pieces and fragments over 9 months of marriage, carefully and always slightly incomplete. "His name is Daniel Osei," she said quietly, watching Daniel across the floor. Loud now, performing outrage for the crowd and the security guards, still utterly unaware of what he had stepped into. "He's my ex, from before I came to Korea. It's complicated, and it's over. And put Park on the phone, please." She handed the phone to Park, who listened for approximately 20 seconds, said 3 words in Korean, and handed it back. And the expression that had moved briefly across his face in those 20 seconds, and Park had an exceptionally disciplined face, forged over 11 years in rooms that did not reward visible emotion, told Sarah more than the words had. Park looked at the senior security supervisor and said very quietly, "Don't let that man leave. Call your building manager and tell them Kwon Seojun is on his way." And the supervisor stared at him for a moment, and then reached for his radio with the expression of a man who has decided, sensibly, to stop making independent decisions for the remainder of his shift. Around them, the name was spreading through the crowd the way a current moves through water. Invisible, consequential, reaching every corner of the space before most people could have told you it was moving. Daniel's girlfriend pulled at his arm, said something low and urgent, and he pulled free with the magnificent self-defeating confidence of a man who still did not understand that the game had changed, that the board he had been playing on for the last 15 minutes was not the board he thought it was, that he was not, had never been, the most powerful person in this situation. "I don't care who her husband is," he said loudly, for everyone to hear, still performing, still running the playbook that had served him so well for so many years against so many women who had no one to call. "She provoked me. I have witnesses. I'll have her charged." "Daniel," his girlfriend said, staring at her phone, her voice now carrying a very different quality. "Stop talking." He didn't. That was the thing about men like Daniel Osei. They were magnificent at not stopping when they should, which was both their greatest talent and the engine of their eventual, inevitable destruction. And the fact that he was still talking when the elevator doors opened and Kwon Seojun stepped onto the second floor of the Lotte World Mall was perhaps the last ordinary thing that would happen to Daniel for a very long time. He came straight from the Yeouido meeting, still in his charcoal gray suit with the pocket square slightly askew, as though he pulled on the jacket at speed. And he had 6 men with him, none of whom appeared to be hurrying, and all of whom moved with the absolute, unhurried certainty of people who understood that the space they were entering already belonged to them. The crowd parted, not theatrically, not because anyone directed it to, but organically, the way crowds respond to something the body recognizes as significant before the conscious mind has finished processing the signal. Sojun's eyes found Zara immediately, crossed directly to her through the open floor without acknowledging anyone else, and crouched in front of her with a gentleness so completely at odds with everything about the way he had just moved through that room that it seemed to steal the breath from everyone watching. His hands came to her face, tilting it up, reading her the way he read everything he valued, carefully, thoroughly, missing nothing. "Let me see," he said softly, and she showed him her palm, and he looked at it and then at her face, and then at the tear tracks she hadn't realized were there until she saw them reflected in the change that moved through his expression. Just once, just briefly, before it was replaced by the absolute stillness of a man who has decided what is going to happen next, and is simply completing the necessary arrangements in his mind. "I'm okay," she whispered. "I know you are," he said, pressing a kiss to her forehead that was soft and slow and entirely unhurried, despite every surrounding circumstance. And then he stood and turned, and for the first time since he had entered the mall, he looked at Daniel Osei. Daniel had stopped talking. The whole floor had gone quiet, in the specific way that spaces go quiet when something has entered them that everyone's instincts are busy classifying. And Daniel stood in the middle of it, and looked at the man looking at him, and seemed to understand, slowly and with visible discomfort, that he had badly miscalculated something. "Your name," Seojun said, with the unhurried precision of a man confirming data he already had, "is Daniel Osei." He paused. "I know what you did to her. Not today, 2 years ago, all of it. And I had decided to leave it alone because she asked me to, and I respect that." Another pause, shorter this time. "But you put your hands on her today. In public. In my city." The word "my" landed in the room with the full weight of everything it contained. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know she was Daniel started, and Seojun said pleasantly, completely. "That's not relevant. Whether you knew who she was doesn't change what you did. It only changes what happens to you next," and turned to give a quiet instruction to his lead man, who nodded and stepped away with his phone already at his ear. "What? What does that mean? You can't just—" Daniel was backing up, but Park was behind him, and there was nowhere to go, and the performance was over now. All the confidence draining out of him in real time, as the thing he'd stepped into became fully, terrifyingly clear. "I'll call the police." "Of course," Seojun said, producing his own phone and extending it toward Daniel with the patient, almost courteous manner of a man who has already thought 3 moves ahead of every possible response. "Go ahead, call them." Daniel looked at the phone. He didn't take it. The security supervisor's radio crackled. He listened, and the color left his face. And he looked at Seojun and said, very quietly, "Mr. Kwon, the floor is yours." And Seojun acknowledged him with the slight nod of a man confirming a reasonable decision, before returning his attention to Daniel with the unhurried focus of someone who has all the time in the world. "We are going to have a conversation," Seojun said. "You and I, privately. And then I am going to explain to you very precisely what is about to happen to your life. And you are going to listen, because you are not, despite everything you currently believe about yourself, in a position to do anything else." Daniel's girlfriend left without being asked a second time. Seojun's men walked Daniel toward the security office at the end of the corridor. Not roughly, not dramatically, simply and efficiently. The way you move something that needs to be somewhere else. And the door closed behind them. And the crowd that had been watching began slowly to remember that it had somewhere to be. Zara sat against the wall and listened to the silence on the other side of that door, and felt something settle in her chest. Not satisfaction yet, not fully, but the beginning of something that might become it. The certainty that this moment was not going to end the way moments like this had always ended for her, which was to say, alone, with the damage done, and the person who caused it already gone and already fine. Minna appeared beside her with a fresh bandage and a bottle of water, and Zara accepted both with hands that had finally stopped shaking. What Zara didn't know, what she had never asked, and Seojun had not volunteered, because the line between husband and Shadow King was something they navigated daily with a careful, mutual respect for which questions were and weren't his to answer unprompted, was that Seojun had known about Daniel Osei for 11 months. He had found out the way he found out most things. Not by asking, but by paying very close attention to the woman he had married, who talked in her sleep sometimes. Not often, only in the deep hours, only when something had pulled her back under the surface of what she'd healed from. Saying a name, a street, the word hospital, in a voice that sounded like a younger woman, a woman who hadn't yet learned to contain her grief during waking hours. He had spoken quietly to Park, who had returned 3 days later with a file that Seojun read alone in his office at midnight. And what the file contained: the pattern of exploitation across 2 countries, the 3 women before Zara who had been too embarrassed or too hurt or too aware of how these stories typically went for women like them to pursue formal complaints. And then the hospital records and the discharge form signed with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking at 6 in the morning while Daniel Osei was presumably somewhere already fine, had required Seojun to sit very still for a very long time. Then he had folded the file, locked it in his safe, walked to their bedroom, and sat beside his sleeping wife in the dark and held her hand until morning, because that was the only response that felt proportionate to what he had just understood. He had not told her about the file, and he had not told her that Daniel Osei's Seoul-based business interests had experienced a quiet, inexplicable series of reversals over the past 8 months. A partnership dissolving at the last moment, a visa renewal moving with unusual slowness through administrative channels, a building lease not renewed in circumstances that Daniel's lawyers had been unable to successfully contest, because she had not asked him to do any of it. And he had done it anyway because he was Kwon Seojun, and Kwon Seojun did not believe in waiting for harm to arise when it could be quietly, efficiently redirected. But today, Daniel had put his hands on her in public, in his city, in front of 100 witnesses and their phones. And the quiet, invisible approach was no longer the appropriate response. Today required something else entirely. The security office door opened. Seojun came out first, jacket rebuttoned, expression clear, the monster entirely returned to wherever he kept it. And behind him, Daniel walked with the careful, slightly diminished movement of a man who had been shown something in a private room that had permanently and irrevocably changed the parameters of his understanding. Daniel looked at Zara. Seojun stepped between them, smoothly and without apparent effort, and said, "You have nothing to say to her. Not today. Not ever. We've discussed this." And Daniel closed his mouth and nodded once and walked away, and his footsteps were the only sound in a corridor that had gone very still. Zara watched him go and felt something unlock in her chest that she hadn't known was locked. A loosening she hadn't realized she'd been waiting 2 years to feel. Seojun came to her side, and she asked quietly, "What did you say to him?" And he considered this with the particular honesty he always gave her, precisely, without volunteering more than was useful, and said, "I told him the truth about what he is, about what his choices have cost other people, and about what I'm going to do now that he's made the mistake of bringing himself to my attention in this particular way." "What are you going to do?" she asked. He met her eyes, and she saw it. Not the husband, not the morning coffee man who had learned her favorite songs and moved tables at charity galas and held her hand through nightmares, but the other one, the one who had built something vast and dangerous out of shadows and favors and the very specific kind of power that came from being the person everyone needed and no one could afford to cross. "Everything," he said, simply and completely. And then he took her hand with the same gentleness he always used when he was most serious, and said, "Come on. I'm taking you home." And she let him, and they walked through the mall together, and the remaining crowd parted, and her name moved through it like a confirmation. Zara Mensa Kwon, wife of Kwon Seojun. And she felt, for the first time in 2 years, the full weight of what that name meant. Not burden. Shield. In the car, he held her bandaged hand the whole way home, and silenced 2 phone calls without checking who they were. And the city lights blurred into the early winter dark outside the window. And Zara thought about the girl she had been, the one who had believed that some people were simply allowed to do damage and walk away clean, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she had been wrong about that for the last time. Whatever Seojun had set in motion in that security office was only just beginning to move, and Daniel Osei had absolutely no idea how far it was going to go. Part 2 is coming, and it is going to be everything. Like this video, subscribe, turn on notifications, and drop your prediction in the comments right now. What is the first thing Seojun does to dismantle Daniel's world? The best answer might just end up in the script.